I never thought that I would live alone in this house at the age of 62, when I wake up every morning in silence, interrupted only by the creaking of the wooden floor and the rustle of the branches of the old maple tree outside the window, and when every evening, running my fingers over the smooth wooden railing, I climb the stairs. It seems to me that I feel under my skin the warmth of the hands of those who did this before me. My parents, their parents, all the generations of my family, who once filled this house with laughter, conversations, and footsteps, now lost in time. This house on Maple Street has been in my family for over a century, and for most of my life I've called it home, a shelter, a place where my roots were, but over the years it's become a reminder that I'm alone, surrounded only by the ghosts of the past. My name is Caroline Mitchell, and 20 years ago my husband Robert left me, choosing a young woman full of energy and life, his 25-year-old secretary, leaving me with my 12-year-old son Tommy, in my arms, with a load of unjustified hopes, resentments, and endless questions that I will never get an answer to. I remember the day he told me he was leaving. I remember down to the smallest detail, his tense back, slightly lowered head, voice barely above a whisper as he fiddled with his wedding ring, avoiding eye contact with me. "I'm sorry, Caroline, I never wanted things to turn out this way," he said, and I heard in his words not remorse, but only a desire to put an end to this conversation as soon as possible. I just stood there, clutching the kitchen table so that my knuckles turned white, and with difficulty forced myself to ask the only question that was spinning in my head. "Does she make you happy, Robert?" He nodded, still not looking at me, and added something about alimony, about the fact that he won't leave us without support, that Tommy won't need anything, but his voice was already sounding somewhere far away, behind a dense wall of pain and betrayal. He kept his promise. The money really came every month without fail, and I saved every penny for Tommy's college fund, while trying to work even harder, take overtime at a marketing firm to cover our daily expenses. But fortunately, we had this house, the last thing my grandmother left me. The last thing that connected me to the past and allowed me to feel that at least something in my life remains unchanged. Once, even a film crew came here, saying that the house perfectly conveys the atmosphere of the 19th century, and the producer offered me to sell it for a sum that would make most people dizzy, but I didn't want to part with it, because for me it was not just a building with four walls and the roof was a legacy, the story of my family, a reflection of my own life. After Robert left, I threw myself into my work and Tommy's upbringing, trying to fill the void that remained inside, but dating and new relationships never seemed right. Even when my colleagues tried to introduce me to someone, I politely refused, joking that now I was married to my career, but the truth was that I had simply lost faith in love, lost the ability to trust anyone enough to open my heart again. Tommy became my whole world, and I did everything possible for him to grow up in love and care, so that he felt confident, knew that he had reliable support, understood that I was always there for him. I would support, help, listen. We had our own habits, our little ritual: breakfast together every morning, help with homework at the very kitchen table where I once heard the words about betrayal, Sunday evenings watching movies when the two of us wrapped ourselves in a warm blanket, laughing at old comedies or discussing the plot of detective stories. Thanks to his father's alimony, Tommy was able to go to a good college, and I was proud of him, proud of the kind of person he had become. But when he brought his girlfriend Amy home, something inside me trembled. Some strange, inexplicable anxiety settled in my chest. I tried to convince myself that it was just a mother's natural jealousy, unwillingness to accept that her son had grown up and now had another family, another person who had become most important to him, but it wasn't just that. Amy was sweet, polite, she smiled a lot, praised the house, was interested in family photos, but her smile never reached her eyes, and when it came to work or her own past, she skillfully turned the conversation to another topic. I told myself that I was being too hypocritical, that I was winding myself up for no reason, but when Tommy announced at dinner, "Mom, we're getting married," I felt a tight knot in my stomach. I forced myself to smile, hugged them both, congratulated them, but deep down I knew something was wrong. At first, I tried to convince myself that my fears were groundless, that Amy was just being polite, that she wanted us to establish a relationship, but something in her voice, in her gaze gliding over every detail of my house, made me wary. She smiled, complimented me, praised the comfort of the rooms, admired the antique furniture that I inherited from my grandmother, but there was something subtly insincere in her voice, something sickly sweet, like cheap artificial syrup that is too sweet. I rejected her offer to move into another room, and to my surprise, she didn't object, just shrugged and smiled sweetly, but there was something like cold calculation in her eyes. Maybe it was my imagination, but when I left the room, I caught her whispering softly to Tommy, and he answered her in a low, almost apologetic tone, as if trying to calm her down. I didn't think much of it, at least not at the time. The first weeks of their stay in my house were relatively quiet. I couldn't help but notice that Tommy tried to be helpful, helped with dinner, cleaned the house, and offered to go shopping from time to time, but Amy, she seemed to disappear into space, never offering to help, never showing the slightest interest in thanking me in any way for my hospitality. She spent her days in the living room, holding her phone in her hands, scrolling through her social media feed, sometimes pretending to sigh, saying how difficult it was to find a decent job now, but I never saw her actually take any active steps in this direction. I tried not to judge her. I tried to remind myself that times are hard, that everyone experiences crises in their own way, but doubts haunted me. One evening, when I returned from work, I found her in my office. She was sitting at my desk, her fingers sliding over the keyboard of my laptop, and an email was open on the screen. I paused in the doorway, feeling my irritation rise. "Amy, what are you doing in my office?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level, but there was already a steely note in it. She flinched, as if she hadn't expected to see me, and quickly closed her laptop, smiling tightly. "Oh, Caroline, I'm sorry. I was just looking for a place to sit quietly. Tommy is asleep, and the living room is too noisy from the street. I didn't think you'd mind." I crossed my arms over my chest, trying to suppress my irritation. "This is my personal space. If you need to work, you have a room, you can use the kitchen table or the living room." She smiled even wider, and her voice became even softer, almost affectionate. Of course, Caroline. I'm sorry, I won't do it again." But as soon as I left the office, I felt her watching me go, and there was something in that look that sent shivers down my spine. A few more weeks passed, and I noticed that Tommy began to look more tired and depressed. He talked less and less, avoided talking about the future, about how Amy's job search was going. Every time I asked her directly, she sighed, shrugged, and said something vague like, "I've sent a few resumes, but nothing yet." But there wasn't the slightest worry or alarm in her voice, just lazy indifference. And then the first really disturbing thing happened. I returned home after a late meeting at work and found that the door to the house was unlocked. It was strange. I always locked it when I left the house, and as far as I knew, Tommy was also careful about such things. I went in, looked around, and everything looked the same as always, but some sixth sense told me that something was wrong. I went into the living room, then into the kitchen, went upstairs, looked into my bedroom, nothing unusual, but my soul was restless. The next morning, I decided to check my jewelry box, which contained old family heirlooms, my mother's ring, a brooch worn by my grandmother, and a gold chain given to me by Robert in the early years of our marriage. When I opened the box, I felt everything inside shrink. The gold chain was gone. I knew I couldn't lose her. I hadn't worn it in years, but I definitely remembered seeing it a few days ago. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I just hadn't noticed how long she'd been missing. But something inside me told me that this was just the beginning. At first, I tried to convince myself that all this was temporary, that Amy was just going through a difficult period, that she was really looking for a job, and that her irritability and outbursts of emotion were not caused by laziness or ingratitude, but by fear of the future. But every day it became more difficult for me to maintain this illusion. The house, which I used to see clean, tidy, saturated with comfort and care, turned into chaos. Dirty dishes piled up in the sink, Trash cans overflowed with takeaway packages, crumpled napkins, empty bottles and glasses were everywhere in the living room, and Amy, as if on purpose, left things where she needed to. It's convenient without thinking about the fact that someone will have to clean up after her. I came home from work more and more tired, feeling like the irritation I was trying to get rid of was accumulating inside, like water behind a dam, ready to burst out at any moment. Tommy didn't seem to notice it, or didn't want to. Every evening, he came home tired and lost in thought, had dinner without even asking how my day had been, and spent a lot of time with Amy in their room, leaving me alone at the kitchen table with plates that no one else was going to wash. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst of it was the feeling that in my own house I no longer had any space, comfort, or even the right to feel like a mistress. One evening, when I returned home later than usual, I heard someone's voice coming from my bedroom. For a moment, my heart sank with anxiety. Did someone break into the house? But when I got closer, I realized it was Amy's voice. I stopped at the half-open door, barely breathing, and listened. "Yes, Tommy says it's just temporary, but you should see the house we live in. Antique furniture, huge windows, even some antique knickknacks. If only you knew how much it could cost." Amy's voice sounded muffled, but there was a strange excitement in it, almost a delight. Who was she calling? What was she talking about? I held my breath, hoping to hear more. No, of course she doesn't want to sell it, but who knows? People change their minds, especially if you put a little pressure on them. At that moment, I abruptly pushed the door open. Amy started, quickly turned to me, and her face instantly changed expression. First confusion, then a guilty smile. "Oh, Caroline, you scared me." I crossed my arms over my chest, forcing myself to remain calm, even though everything was boiling inside me. "Who were you talking to?" "Just with a friend," she replied too hastily, turning off the phone. "We were chatting about nothing." I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes on her. "You said I could change my mind. What exactly were you talking about?" She laughed nervously, got out of bed and stretched, as if warming up after a long conversation. "Oh, Caroline, it's not what you think it is. It's just silly chatter, nothing important." I didn't answer. I just stood there and stared at her, and everything inside turned upside down. I couldn't tell exactly what she was up to, but I knew one thing: she wasn't just idly chatting. There was some urgency in her voice, some subtle hint of manipulation, and I couldn't shake the feeling that a play was being played out in my own home, in which I was cast as an unsuspecting spectator. After this incident, I began to notice even more disturbing signals. One day I caught her in my office for the second time, even though she swore she wouldn't go in there again. Another time, she seemed to stare too intently at photos of my family, especially old pictures with my parents, with my grandparents, with those who built this house and put all their love into it. But the most disturbing thing was the conversation I overheard between her and Tommy. I was just about to enter the kitchen, but when I heard their voices, I stopped in the doorway. "I'm just saying it's not okay, Tommy," Amy was saying, sounding annoyed. "We've been living with your mother for 3 months now, and she doesn't even offer to help us get back on our feet. She has money, she has a house that is worth a fortune, but she doesn't even want to think about selling it and helping us." "Amy, she won't sell it, you know," Tommy sighed. "Why? Why doesn't she think about us? We're young, we need to build a life, and she's just clinging to this old house like it's her only value." "Tommy, I'm serious. If we had that money, we could." I didn't listen anymore. I turned around and quietly left the house to breathe in the cold night air to try to calm my racing heart. I couldn't deny the obvious anymore. Amy didn't just live in my house. She's up to something. I stood in the center of the living room, watching Tommy clench his fists, and his face darken with anger. There was more than just annoyance in my son's eyes, more than just resentment. There was something more in them, something that hurt me the most. Distrust. "Do you really not understand, Mom?" His voice was low, raspy, full of tension I hadn't heard before. "You are constantly putting pressure on Amy, constantly trying to show that she is not the boss here, that she is not your equal. I'm tired of this." I felt a pain flare up in my chest, but I knew that now was not the time for weakness, not the time to lower my head and give up. "Tell me," I wanted to help. "You know that I've always wanted the best for you, and if you would just stop for a second and think." "Stop and think?" He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "Do you even hear yourself? You've been treating Amy like an enemy since the moment she set foot in this house." I opened my mouth to protest, but froze. Did I really treat her like an enemy? Was I being unfair? Or maybe I just let my protective instinct, my fear, my premonition overshadow my common sense. But no. I saw how she behaved, I heard her words, I noticed how her eyes searched my house, how she was surreptitiously manipulating Tommy, making him see me as an enemy. I couldn't let him get on this path. "Tommy," I took a step forward, cautiously, as if I were approaching a wild animal ready to attack at any second. "Don't you notice that there's something wrong with her? Have you seen how she talks about me, how she talks about home?" "Mom, that's enough." His voice exploded, angry and broken. "I don't want to hear this. Amy is my wife, and I won't let you treat her like that." I bit my tongue, clenching my hands into fists. "Tommy, I'm your mother. I'm just trying. Stop it." He sighed, then looked at me in a way he'd never looked at me before, a look that pierced right through me, cold and distant. "If you really care about me, you'll accept the fact that Amy is here and stay here as long as we need to." I wanted to say that that's not the point, that it's not that she's here, but how she behaves. But I saw that he wasn't listening. Or he doesn't want to listen. Tommy shook his head and headed up the stairs. I could hear him coming into their room, the door slamming shut, and the silence in the house for a few seconds, which was heavier than any scream. I slowly sank into a chair, feeling my hands tremble. Amy got her way. She finally drove a wedge between me and Tommy. But I wasn't going to give up. I couldn't sleep that night. I could hear the muffled voices from Tommy and Amy's room. I could hear them talking to each other, his voice sounding tired and hers tense. I could hear the floorboards creaking, the bathroom door closing softly, but most of all I could hear my own pulse, booming, rising like an alarm bell. And the next morning, when I came downstairs, I found Amy in the kitchen, dressed in my bathrobe. She was standing at the coffee machine, lazily stirring sugar in a cup. Her hair was disheveled, her face was contented, and when she looked at me, her lips curved into a slow, snake-like smile. "Good morning, Caroline," she said, taking a sip of coffee, as if this were her home, her kitchen, her life. And at that moment, I realized that if I didn't do something, soon all of this would really cease to be mine. I looked at my son, and I was overcome by a strange feeling, as if in front of me was not the boy I raised, not the caring, intelligent, reasonable Tommy he always was, but someone else, controlled by someone who thoughtlessly repeated the words of his wife, not realizing that there had been no place for me in this house for a long time, just for her whims and whims. "Tommy," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice calm, so that there was no reproach or despair in it, even though everything was boiling inside me. "This is my home. I'm not against guests, I'm not against you hosting dinners or inviting friends, but this." I took a deep breath, struggling to find the words. "This is more than just dinner. It's a party for dozens of people, it's a bar in the lobby, it's a furniture rearrangement, it's—" "Mom," he interrupted me, looking down, as if he was ashamed, as if he knew I was right but couldn't admit it. "I understand, but Amy is so excited about this idea. We've been married for almost 2 years, and we haven't had a really beautiful holiday. She just wants to feel special, wants us to have an evening that we'll remember." I chuckled. "Tommy, is that what you want? Do you really think this is a good idea?" He hesitated. I could see two forces fighting inside him, his affection for me, the desire not to hurt my feelings, and at the same time the desire to avoid conflict with Amy, to avoid another spectacle full of sobs and accusations. "It's just one night," he said finally. I shook my head. "No, Tommy, it's not just one night. It's a matter of respect. It's a question of the fact that this house is mine, that I live in it, and I don't want to see a crowd of people here whom I don't even know. And you understand that." Tension appeared on his face, and I could see that he was trying to find words, but before he could answer, Amy's voice came from behind him. "Oh, Caroline," she drawled with a smile, and her tone was so sweetly sugary that my stomach clenched. "You're complicating things. We're a family, aren't we? Shouldn't it be natural to share space, to share joy?" She took a few steps forward with her arms folded across her chest, her long manicured nails tapping on the sleeve of her cashmere sweater, and there was obvious mockery in her eyes. "You said yourself that this house has always been a place for a family, a place where generations gathered. Well, now you have a chance to fill it with voices, laughter, and music again. Isn't that wonderful?" I gritted my teeth. Fill it with voices that I do not know? The laughter of people who don't care whose house it is and who just want to have fun? It's not filling, Amy. This is turning my house into a nightclub. Her smile faltered. "Well, I'm sorry we don't meet your standards," she said coldly, then turned to Tommy. "We shouldn't have asked her, Tommy. We gave her a chance to show what kind of person she is again, but it seems your mother has only one desire, to lock herself in this house and never share with anyone." Tommy looked tired. "Let's just stop this conversation," he muttered. But I wasn't going to back down. "You're not having a party here." Amy clenched her jaw. "Oh, really?" "Yes, that's it." I took a step forward, feeling my voice become really firm for the first time in a long time. "This is my house, Amy. And I don't care what you're thinking." I saw her face contort with anger for a moment, but then, almost instantly, she changed tactics. "Tommy, I don't feel welcome here." Her voice trembled. She stepped closer to him, taking his hand. Her fingers gently squeezed his palm. "I can't do this anymore. I tried, I really tried, but your mom, she just won't accept me, and it's so hard for me." She sobbed, and Tommy seemed to shrink under her gaze. "Baby, please don't start," he sighed softly. "No, Tommy, I'm serious." She shook her head, still clutching his hand. "Maybe we really should find something of our own. Here it seems to me that I'm just superfluous." I held my breath. "That's it." She was trying to turn the situation around. Make yourself a victim. To get him to take her side. I watched as Tommy lowered his head, as his shoulders slumped a little. "Let's talk about this later, okay?" he finally said. She didn't say anything, just sighed sadly, turned around and went upstairs, leaving him standing in the middle of the kitchen at a complete loss. I knew I had lost this round. But I also knew that the war wasn't over yet. I waited, hoping that Tommy would say at least something, that he would see in Amy's words a clumsy attempt to oust me from my own home, that he would finally understand how far his wife had come, but he just looked away, as if he had suddenly found something extremely interesting in the pattern on the carpet, like he'd rather be anywhere but here, between us. "Tommy," my voice sounded firmer than I expected. "Is that true? Do you really want me to leave?" He hesitated, his lips twitched, as if he wanted to say something, but then he raised his head and looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something that made everything inside me stop. "Mom," he exhaled, "just don't make a scene, okay? This is an important evening for us. We've been preparing a lot, and you think I'm going to ruin it with my mere presence?" I didn't recognize my voice. There was something icy in it, something I hadn't felt since Robert told me he was leaving 20 years ago. Tommy looked away again, but this time not because he was embarrassed. He did it deliberately, as if he really didn't care. "It's not like that, Mom," he muttered, "just Just let us spend this evening the way we want." Amy smiled contentedly, tilted her head slightly to one side and gently took his hand, her nails gently sliding over his skin, as if she reminded him who was the boss here. "See? It's nothing to worry about, Caroline," she said, as if comforting a moody child. "After all, we're only here because of your kindness, but we'd like to feel free for once." I took a slow breath, holding back the storm that was bubbling inside me, holding back the urge to scream, throw something, do something to destroy this artificial world that she had built around Tommy, wrapping her sly words around him, blinding him with feigned gentleness. I looked at the guests, who were casting curious glances at me, some with sympathy, some with mockery, but no one said a word, because for them I was a stranger, unnecessary, just a mother who showed up at the wrong time, interfering with the fun. I took a step back, then another, and at that moment I noticed that there were no more photos of my family on the wall. Instead, there were some trendy, soulless abstract paintings that Amy had obviously brought. Grandma's antique vase, which had stood on the fireplace for more than half a century, was gone, and in its place stood something bright and tasteless, another decorative element that Amy considered more appropriate. My house, it didn't look like mine anymore. "Okay," I nodded, feeling my voice tremble treacherously, but not from weakness, from anger, from resentment, from the feeling that I had lost, although I did not even understand when this battle began. "I'm leaving." Amy threw up her hands, her face lit up with triumph. "Oh, Caroline, you're doing a very wise thing. Of course, we'll save some dessert for you if you want to take it with you." I didn't listen to her. I turned around, feeling a chill run through my skin, my fingers cramping with tension, and a growing feeling inside me, as if I had just closed a door behind me that would never open again. I walked through the crowd, avoiding the eyes of the guests, left the house and slammed the door behind me. The night was cool, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the deserted road. I walked slowly down the steps of the porch, groped for my phone in my pocket, but I didn't know who to call. I've never felt so alone. But at the same time, I realized that I had never been so angry. I stood in the middle of a ruined, devastated house, feeling the weight that had been weighing on me for the past few months finally settle in my chest, pulling strength out of me, forcing me to endure, to remain silent, to watch as my own world, my home, my life gradually flowed through my fingers like sand. It's all over now. Amy is gone, Tommy is gone, their stuff, their noise, their fake smiles and honey voices, all of this has finally left my walls. I inhaled slowly, feeling the air fill my lungs, as every cell in my body regains its lost space, as the house becomes quiet again, but it was a different silence, not oppressive, not hostile, not the one that makes me feel lonely, but the silence of victory, the silence of freedom, the silence that finally belonged to me. Everything around was a reminder of the chaos that had passed. There were empty spaces on the shelves where family photos used to stand, crumpled napkins and overturned glasses lay on the floor, furniture was shifted as if it had been rearranged in a hurry, and plates of untouched snacks were piled on the table, expensive cheeses, exquisite canapes, half-spilled bottles of wine. I pursed my lips, then slowly, without fuss, began to clean up. I collected the remnants of the party, slowly, methodically, as if every plate I wrapped, every glass I emptied, every tiny gesture was an act of regaining control over the house, over life, over myself. The food they had so pompously ordered from an expensive catering company, the food they hadn't even bothered to enjoy, went into containers. I knew that there would be those at the homeless shelter that night who would really be grateful for every bite. I went through the house, restoring order. I picked up the scattered pillows from the floor, replaced my favorite reading chair, and brushed away the remains of someone's cigarette ashes from the tables. In the kitchen, I rearranged all the items in their usual places, returned the kettle to where it always stood, straightened the towels, and threw the shiny plastic cups that Amy had brought to hell, replacing my real glasses with them. I took off the garlands and gaudy paper lanterns she had decorated my house with, as if it were a cheap banquet hall instead of a place where generations of my family had lived. I put family photos back on the walls, one by one, as if bringing back to the house those who lived here before me, those who would not allow themselves to be ousted so easily let someone else decide what should be here. It was only when I was done, when the house felt the way I needed it again, when the space no longer felt alien to me, that I allowed myself to stop. I went out on the porch, inhaled the fresh air, and the night breeze gently touched my face, dispelling the last remnants of anger and disappointment. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if Tommy would call me, if he would try to understand, if he would try to justify Amy, or if he would finally realize what exactly she had done, what exactly he had lost. But at that moment, I didn't care. I wasn't going to take it anymore. I wasn't going to beg anyone to see me anymore. I wasn't going to let anyone dictate what I should do in my house anymore. This house has become mine again. And with that thought, I closed the door behind me, knowing that for the first time in a long time, I would sleep peacefully. The weeks after their departure passed in silence, but in the very silence that does not depress, but gives peace, as if after a long storm, when the air is still saturated with moisture, but the sky is already clear, and you can finally take a deep breath. I wasn't in a hurry to fill the house with sounds. On the contrary, I enjoyed every moment of solitude, every morning ray of sunshine coming through the curtains, every evening spent with a book in my hands and a cup of hot tea on the table next to me. I was bringing the house back to life, to the life it had breathed before they appeared, to a life in which there was room only for those who truly appreciated it. I returned the chair to the window, and now every evening, sitting in it, I could watch the sunset flood the street with warm golden light. Family photos took their places on the walls again, and as I passed by, I saw myself, the one who was next to little Tommy, who held his hand on the beach, adjusted his baseball cap before the first game, hugged him at the graduation, proud of him to tears. My grandmother's vase, which I so wanted to protect from Amy's hands, was back in the center of the dining table, and now, every time I put flowers there, I felt that I was preserving something important, not just an object, but also a memory, a tradition, a connection with those who lived here before me. News about Tommy and Amy came to me through friends, through acquaintances, or through casual conversations in a coffee shop when people were whispering about that couple in a new apartment complex. Sarah, who worked in real estate, told me over a cup of coffee that they barely managed to pass the rent check, that Tommy's new salary played a crucial role, but if he didn't have a stable job, they would have been rejected. But you know what's funny? Sarah put the cup on the saucer and leaned a little closer, as if she was going to share something particularly spicy. Janet, my old friend from the rental office, says that there have already been problems with them. The manager complained several times about the condition of their apartment. Dirt, garbage, mountains of unwashed dishes. I just nodded, because I didn't need to hear the details to get the picture. I saw all this at home when they lived here. I saw Amy lazily scrolling through her phone, surrounded by mugs of unfinished coffee, as Tommy comes home from work and doesn't even sit down at the table, but just takes a container of food and goes into their room so as not to bump into me. Then there were new stories. About the arguments that couldn't be hidden behind the walls, about the screams coming into the hallways, about the neighbors complaining, about how Amy threw things in a rage when something didn't go according to her script. "She's always yelling at him," Linda whispered to me at lunch, her eyes expressing both curiosity and concern. "She says that he gets a miserable salary, that her friends live in a completely different way, that she did not try for such a life." I listened in silence, gripping my fork a little tighter. "And Tommy?" I asked, barely recognizing my own voice. Linda shook her head. "Fighting back, defending himself. But they say he sometimes sleeps in the car. One day, he was seen late at night in the park, just sitting on a bench, as if he didn't want to come home." My heart sank. Not for Amy, but for her. I no longer have any sympathy left. But for Tommy, he was still my son. No matter what. Sometimes I picked up my phone, looked at its number, which I knew by heart, and felt my fingers freeze over the screen. But I never pressed the call. It was his way. His lesson. He must see the truth for himself, understand who he has become, realize what he has done and how he allowed Amy to push away from him the only person who has always, unconditionally loved him. And the house has become different. Peaceful, yes, but at the same time full of expectation. It was as if he also felt that this was not the end of the story. In the evenings, I sat in an armchair, wrapped my hands around a cup of hot tea, and looked at the photos on the wall. I remembered that boy who once ran to me with skinned knees, with a broken toy car, believing that mom could fix everything, that mom could fix any damage, heal any wound. But I couldn't fix that. I could only wait. I could only hope that one day, when he was ready to admit his mistakes, when he saw the path he had taken and where it had led him, he would find the strength to take a step back. I could only believe that he would remember who he really was. And when that day comes, if it comes, I'll be here. Not for Amy. This bridge has been burned down, and the road to it is littered with rubble. But for Tommy, I will be here, in our family home, in the very house that he knew from childhood, which he called his own, in the very place where he will always be expected, where he will always be loved. Meanwhile, I continued to live. I joined a book club, started taking art lessons, and went to the gallery every Sunday just to walk among the paintings and soak up the silence. I even adopted a cat from the shelter, a red-haired one with intelligent green eyes and an independent personality. I named him Oliver, and he turned out to be a great companion. In the evenings, he would settle down next to me, curl up in a ball. His fur was warm and soft, and his purring filled the room with a quiet, cozy sound. We didn't feel the need to fill the silence with words. Life went on as usual. And when Tommy's ready, he'll know where to find me.